They all relate to false statements on a federal form in which Hunter Biden purchased weapons, and he said, "I am not using drugs," when in fact he was using drugs.
There's no reason why these appropriations bills have been stood up by a few folks. It's holding up the progress of the House, and it undermines our party and our conference.
Corrupt Marsha Blackburn is owned by the NRA and big pharma and insurance companies. We need someone who answers to the people.
Hello, I'm Weijia Jiang in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. A federal grand jury has indicted Hunter Biden on gun charges. It's the first time the U.S. government has filed felony criminal charges against a child of a sitting president. President Biden's son is accused of falsely claiming he was not using illegal drugs when he bought a gun back in 2018 in October. The indictment comes after a plea agreement fell apart in July. If convicted, he could face up to 25 years in prison. CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge joins us now. Catherine, this is not a very lengthy indictment. What are prosecutors saying that Hunter Biden did?
Well, it all goes to the possession of the weapon and allegations that he lied about the status of his drug use when he obtained the weapons. The first two counts are felony counts, and they relate to making a false statement about the drug use on a federal gun form. And the second is continuing those false statements when he purchased the weapon from a gun dealer. And then the last one is simply possessing the weapon while he was on narcotics.
And as we mentioned, this was part of a plea agreement that you watched fall apart in real time, but that also included other potential charges with tax charges.
That's
so
right.
Should we expect more down the pike?
I think the short answer is yes. The door is wide open to additional charges in this case on the alleged tax violations. Just to look back to late July, there was a broad agreement that would have been for misdemeanor tax charges and then for a felony gun offense. And that would have been wiped clean if Hunter Biden abided by the terms of the deal. That fell apart over the simple question that the two sides were not in agreement over whether that broad deal shielded him from potential criminal charges in the future. So they've been litigating different elements of the agreement since, especially the gun agreement. But the government's position is that it is not valid, and they have now charged him today.
So what happens next? Obviously, he'll be arraigned. Do we know when? Do we know when we might see more charges?
So in order to bring any tax charges in this case, Special Counsel Weiss will have to go to a grand jury in another jurisdiction where he has the venue to bring those charges. So in other words, where the alleged crime took place. That is not Delaware. Based on the court filings, that's either Washington, D.C. or out in California. To answer your question about the felony gun offense, it will proceed like the hundreds of other felony gun offenses do in the federal system. There would be an arraignment, then there would be different motions by the sides. We can expect Hunter Biden's legal team to argue the charges are not valid because of the prior agreement on the gun offense, but also that there are constitutional questions here. There's litigation in the courts over whether barring drug users from possessing a weapon does violate their constitutional rights.
And those are still playing out. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But could they use that as their argument, even though there has not been a ruling on that?
Well, they could certainly use it. We spoke with a former senior Justice Department official who said it would be extremely ironic if the sort of poster case for this question of the constitutionality of barring a drug user from possessing a weapon became President Biden's son.
So it could be even more historic than
I think so.
It already is. Thank you so much,
You're
Catherine.
welcome.
For more on the political fallout from all of this, CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian joins us now. Nicole, it's great to be with you. I'm sure that there's a lot of reactions from Republicans about this. What are they saying?
Well, really, reaction, as you can imagine, Weijia, is falling on party lines, you know, in terms of Republicans, and many of them seem to feel like this is potentially just a slap on the wrist. As Oversight Chair James Comer put it, he believes that these are easy charges, and he feels that they don't go far enough. Take a listen.
That's the one crime that he committed that you cannot tie Joe Biden into. So we'll see what happens with the other 11 or so crimes that the president's son's committed.
But I can assure you that I spent 10 years as a federal prosecutor, and I can assure you that Chairman Comer and Chairman Jordan do not know what goes into charging criminal charges and what is required. And so if they are going to say there should be more charges against Hunter Biden, they don't know what they're talking about.
Of course, that was Dan Goldman, a Democrat who was the impeachment counsel in 2019. And, you know, his position on this, because I asked him whether or not he thinks that, for instance, these charges will fuel House Republicans, given the impeachment inquiry that was announced this week. And as you heard from him there, he said, you know, these Republicans, I mean, they're not prosecutors. So really, if they think they're going to see more charges, you know, they don't really know what they're doing here. We also heard from Jamie Raskin, who is a ranking member on the Oversight Committee, who, you know, criticized Republicans, saying, you know, they can't applaud for the system when it comes to Hunter Biden and then try to tear it down when it comes to former President Trump. So, again, we certainly expect this to continue to play out as Republicans in particular ramp up their investigations into Hunter Biden, the Biden family, and some of the president's associates, although, as you know, the White House continues to insist there's no evidence of wrongdoing.
Yes, they are repeating that every chance they get. You brought up former President Trump, Nicole. There was some news today out of Fulton, Georgia, where he faces criminal charges. What can you tell us about when he might go to trial?
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like it's going to be anytime soon. As you know, this is a very big case involving 19 defendants, including the former president. Two of those defendants, Sidney Powell, who was a legal counsel for the former president, and Kenneth Chesborough, who authored two memos with respect to a fake elector scheme. Those two individuals have requested a speedy trial. And so last week, a judge granted their request to hold that trial next month. But what the judge did rule today is that the other defendants, including the former president, will not be tried next month. He does not think that there is enough time to try to pull together a trial with so many individuals. So the district attorney asked for her reaction today at a press conference later this afternoon. You know, she did say that she was okay with that, provided the other defendants in this case didn't also request a speedy trial. Certainly the district attorney is concerned that, you know, if all of these defendants try to break off their cases, that it could really strain the judicial system in Fulton County. So the hope is maybe these two individuals will be tried together in October and then the others at a later date.
Nicole, it's so stunning that that is going to be part of the backdrop of the 2024 election. And so is this impeachment inquiry into President Biden, which I know you asked House leaders about today. What are they saying today?
Oh, well, obviously, you know, House Democrats are pretty frustrated by all that is going on with respect to this impeachment inquiry. You know, I did have a chance to talk to Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who held a news conference a bit earlier today, and he continues to dismiss this inquiry as a stunt.
There is no evidence, not a shred of evidence, that President Biden engaged in wrongdoing. There is not a shred of evidence that President Biden committed an impeachable offense. There is not a shred of evidence that President Biden broke the law. This illegitimate impeachment inquiry is a partisan political stunt, period, full stop.
I did ask him what Democrats' strategy will be now that this impeachment inquiry has been launched, whether that's messaging, whether that's trying to block records requests or subpoenas. And what the leader told me is that, you know, they plan to counter Republicans with the truth and the facts, that they believe that this impeachment inquiry was ordered by the former president himself. And, you know, the leader went on to say that, you know, Congress writ large, but particularly House Republicans really need to be focused on more pressing matters, including preventing the government from shutting down at the end of this month.
Which is another big question mark. Thank you so much, Nicole. Great to see you.
You too.
Senator Mitt Romney is calling the Trump base the populist and demagogue portion of the party. His former senior advisor joins our political panel next. You're streaming America Decides.
There's no question but that the Republican Party today is in the shadow of Donald Trump. He is the leader of the greatest portion of the Republican Party. It's a populist, I believe, demagogue portion of the party. Look, I represent a small wing of the party, if you will. I call it the wise wing of the Republican Party.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Utah Republican Senator Mitt Romney yesterday describing the Trump base of the Republican Party. Romney also made it official that he will not seek a second term in the Senate. McKay Coppins, in an excerpt in The Atlantic of his forthcoming book about the senator, wrote, quote, "Romney's isolation in Washington didn't surprise me. In less than a decade, he'd gone from Republican standard-bearer and presidential nominee to party pariah thanks to a series of public clashes with Trump." Christian Ramos and Kevin Madden join us now. Christian is a Democratic strategist and senior advisor at Way to Win. And Kevin is a senior partner at the Penta Group and served as a senior advisor and spokesman to Mitt Romney's 2012 and 2008 presidential campaigns. Thank you both so much for being with us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Kevin, I want to read you a little more from Coppins' book excerpt and get your reaction. He says, quote, "A very large portion of my party," Romney told me one day, "really doesn't believe in the Constitution." And he'd realized this only recently. So I wonder if you think that had a part to play in his decision to leave.
Yeah, I think it had a tremendous impact on him. And I think it probably grew harder and harder for him to rationalize and deal with internally over time as he saw more and more of it as he was in the Senate. There just is this canyon between what people say publicly about Donald Trump and and also I think with the importance that of confronting Donald Trump, I think inside the party, and then what they say publicly and what they do publicly and how they lead fights or communicate the type of important details that maybe some of their constituents or party members or party leaders need to know. So I think that canyon increasingly remains tough to right now to bridge. And that's why I think in all the public remarks that he's made since his announcement, he's sort of spoken to that. And I think the thing that I always remembered about Romney and what made it really easy to work for him is, you go through these 18-hour days, really tough campaigns. But when you're working for somebody who's an optimist and has a really good sense of the chart forward, it becomes a very incentivizing thing. And I think it's become harder and harder as you work through the Senate and he's dealt with some of the folks internally in the party for him to be optimistic about it. I still think he's an optimist. I still think he has a hopeful view of where the party can go and where the country can go. But that ultimately, if we're going to manifest some of that, it has to return to a sort of new generation of leaders. And that was, I think, the crux of what he was saying yesterday.
Sorry, go ahead. You were going to chime in?
No, I was just, first, we're not going to see the likes of Mitt Romney in the Republican Party, I think, ever again or for a long time. And the reason I laughed or smirked is because the next generation of the Republican Party is MAGA. It's MAGA. And I think MAGA is everything that Mitt Romney hates about the current Republican movement. And so it's tough, right? He has to be looking at the writing on the wall with Mitch McConnell and his health and what's going on in the Senate and what happens when Mitch McConnell goes. Mitch McConnell was another outspoken critic of the president. When I talk to folks on the Hill and they talk to me about the dynamic there with McConnell leaving, Mitch McConnell was the guy who held the line against the MAGA extremism. And so people like Mitt Romney, of course, they're like, what am I going to do now?
And Democrats are pointing to MAGA as what's fueling the impeachment inquiry on Capitol Hill, at least in part.
Sure.
So
yes.
I wonder, now that it is an inquiry, does that make it more difficult to defend against or to dismiss, as many Democrats were doing?
This is what I'll say. Kevin McCarthy is trying to hold on to his speaker's gavel. Doing impeachment plus the budget negotiations, he is just trying to keep the right flank of his caucus, which is large, in check. And he is doing anything that he can to give them little pieces of this and that to keep them from voting him out as speaker. And that's really all this is.
Do you agree with that, Kevin?
Well, I think that's an important part of it. I think the danger in that is when you have something as weighty of a constitutional process like impeachment and you get pressured into it, it becomes very impossible to manage. And if you think about the trying to manage an impeachment inquiry at the same time where, what are we, 17 days away from a potential budget showdown where all of your attention should be applied there, the problems start to pile up. And I think the strategies you're going to need to really manage this conference, which is a very volatile conference, and there are some appetites in there about impeaching Trump that are sort of rabid. Mm-hmm. It becomes really increasingly problematic, and it increasingly becomes problematic when you start to look at the electoral politics of this, because if you look at the folks that make or break national elections, who's going to control the House, who's going to control the Senate, who's going to win the presidency, those suburban swing voters, they do not like chaos. They do not like this type of instability. Right. So while a lot of folks will communicate that to McCarthy, we have to do this if we're going to win the majority back, there's probably a greater likelihood that it could potentially cost them.
Well, of course, at the center of the inquiry is Hunter Biden, and I have to ask you about today's big development because he was indicted on that gun charge. Christiane, is this going to make it harder for President Biden because he sort of, we know that talking about his family is his Achilles heel. He wants to talk about his family. He wants to defend his family. This is hard.
Of course it's hard. And you know what? Joe Biden is a great father, and he loves his son. And of course, you're right. He's a human being, and this is tough. I'll say two things here. One, we got a record of job creation. We got a small business creation. We've done a lot of incredible things in the economy. And as long as we're talking about that, we're good. And the rest of this stuff, it's got to play out in the court system, and people are going to have to figure that out. But at this point, look, the president is focused on the job at hand, on an economic recovery that is working for everybody.
And we have to go, but Kevin, quickly, is that going to be enough to overcome the impeachment inquiry and Hunter Biden charges?
No, because the court of law, where this might be fought out of the court of an impeachment process and the court of public opinion, they tend to intersect here. In the court of public opinion, one of the things I worry about if I was a Democrat is at every step of the way, the Hunter Biden inquiries have gotten more and more embarrassing for the White House, and more headlines come out that are negative. So that would be a problem I'd have to worry about if I were a Democrat.
We will be watching. Thank you both so much for your time.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Tennessee 3-member Gloria Johnson is looking to unseat Republican Marsha Blackburn in the U.S. Senate. We will speak to her about her campaign coming up. You're streaming America Decides.
They have called me a liberal, extremist, a socialist. Boy, are they blowing it up today. I'm not sure what they're afraid of, but I have an idea.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Tennessee State Representative Gloria Johnson announcing her bid for U.S. Senate. She was a member of the Tennessee Three. That was a trio of Democratic lawmakers who Republicans tried to expel from the state legislature over their gun control protest on the House floor. Tennessee State Representative Gloria Johnson joins us now. Representative Johnson, it's great to see you.
Well, it's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Tennessee has not elected a Democrat to the U.S. Senate since 1990. And I wonder why you think that could change this time around.
Well, the reason I believe that can change is because the Republican Party is not your granddad's Republican Party anymore. They're very extreme. We see people all across this state that want something different. They're not happy with the extremism in the Republican Party. And currently in Tennessee, we have more Democrats and independents than we do Republicans. And what we are seeing from people, they are completely unhappy with being ignored. When it comes to gun violence, 80% of Tennessee families wanted to see some gun sense legislation. And our supermajority just was not having it. And the reality is Marsha Blackburn is the same. And corrupt Marsha Blackburn is owned by the NRA and big pharma and insurance companies. We need someone who answers to the people. And, I live in Red, East Tennessee. Districts were drawn to beat me, and they've spent hundreds and thousands of dollars doing it. And I have always been able to build a coalition to win folks and independents and Republicans as well. And I've always outperformed the top of the ticket. And I think with the way folks are feeling today, we are absolutely going to be able to replicate that statewide.
You just brought up gun laws and gun reform. Of course, that is why you may look familiar to many of our viewers, because you were, of course, one of the Tennessee Three that stormed the House floor in your state. And I wonder how much of that is going to be part of your campaign. I know you've also spoken about abortion at length as well and women's rights. So how would you describe what you're running on?
Well, clearly it is an agenda that the majority of Tennesseans agree with. They always try to paint me as some sort of radical, but the reality is all of the legislation that I have brought in the State House and what I will focus on in D.C. or as a U.S. Senator, I'm going to be focusing on those issues that really affects people in their home and just lifting up and making sure that Tennessee families thrive by making sure they have access to affordable health care. And for women, that means reproductive choice for them and their autonomy over their own body. And then 80% of Tennesseans, Republican, Independent, and Democratic, want to see gun sense legislation. I will continue to fight for that. In making sure that our public schools, that every child in every zip code has a great school to go to, because there's so much going on now with privatizing our public schools, and we've got to make sure that we keep our public schools strong and that we're allowed to teach our factual history, because democracy, the bedrock of democracy is public education, and we've got to make sure that we're improving it, but we also need to make sure that we're fully funding it and not draining tax dollars away for unproven ventures, quite frankly.
Senator Marsha Blackburn, your opponent that you just brought up, she, when it comes to abortion, says that you support it until, quote, after birth, which is something you have denied. So I wonder, what is your stance on abortion and what do you want the Tennessee law to be?
Well, what she's talking about is murder. I want women to have bodily autonomy. I want decisions to be made in the doctor's office between women, their family, and their physician, the way that we have been doing it. And women need access to abortion, and abortion is health care. And late-term abortion is something they always try to bring up, but it's propaganda. When no one decorates their nursery and then decides to have an abortion. When there are those late-term abortions, that's about traumatic situations and dangerous situations for a fetus or a mother. And they have got to make these tough decisions that no one wants to have to make, but medical diagnoses demand that something is done and lives have to be saved. And so those decisions sometimes have to be made. But what we can do to make sure that women are healthy going into pregnancy is make sure they have access to affordable care their whole lives, so they don't find themselves pregnant with no physician and just starting to get care after they become pregnant. We need to make sure we're taking care of people, but we also need to make sure that women have full autonomy over their own bodies, or women are not equal if they do not.
All right, Representative Johnson, thank you so much for your time today. Hope to have you back sometime.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
That does it for today. Thanks for watching. They're streaming CBS News.